All right, so get this.
Yeah.
We're diving deep today into something pretty major happening right now in Australia.
Reconciliation.
Exactly, reconciliation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I mean, you've probably heard about it, but we're going way beyond just headlines and straight to the source,
Straight to the source.
The 2021 State of Reconciliation in Australia report.
Oh, yeah. This report, it's like a health check for the nation, right?
Yeah, like a progress report.
Yeah. Tells us where we're at, what's working, what needs a serious boost.
Okay, so, and here's a big takeaway, straight from the get-go. Like 95%
95%.
of Australians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, agree that this relationship is super important. I mean, wow.
Almost everyone.
That's a lot of people. That's almost everyone. Clearly, something is resonating, but the report doesn't just stop at the feel-good stuff. It actually digs into what reconciliation means, like in actual practice.
Right. It breaks it down
Yeah, break it down.
into 5 key dimensions, kind of like the pillars of a strong foundation.
Oh,
Historical acceptance, race relations, equality and equity, institutional integrity and unity.
okay. That's a lot.
And get this, they're all intertwined progress in one area.
Uh-huh.
It has a ripple effect on the others.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack those dimensions one by one. I
Alright.
guess starting with historical acceptance, that seems pretty straightforward,
Yep.
right? Owning up to the past and all.
Yeah.
But what does that actually look like?
Well, it's about acknowledging the wrongs, for sure, especially the impact of colonization.
Yeah.
Think truth-telling initiatives, memorials, even retelling Australian history, but from an Indigenous perspective. It's about painting a fuller picture,
Yeah.
not shying away from the difficult stuff.
So it's not just saying sorry, it's actually changing the whole narrative.
Exactly.
Okay, wow.
Now, race relations, that's the next dimension, and it's not just about being polite, right?
Yeah, I was thinking that's kind of a lower bar.
Totally. It's about dismantling racism and not just individual prejudice,
Right,
but the systemic stuff,
right.
the stuff baked into institutions.
Like the deep-rooted stuff.
Yeah, the unconscious bias training anti-racism campaigns, just a couple of examples.
So we're talking about a real shift in mindset and behavior, both individually and
Selectively.
collectively. Yeah, okay.
Which brings us to equality and equity. This was all about closing the gap,
Right.
ensuring that Indigenous Australians have equal opportunities and outcomes in health education, employment justice, you name it.
I mean, you're probably familiar with the term closing the gap, but this report isn't just about throwing money at the problem, right?
It goes deeper than that. It's about recognizing the unique rights of Indigenous peoples and supporting their self-determination.
Right.
Think of it like empowering communities to have a real say in the decisions that affect their lives.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right, so now we've got institutional integrity. This one sounds a bit more well-official.
A little bit, yeah.
What's the deal here?
Yeah, what are we talking about?
Think of it this way. If we want true reconciliation, it's not enough for companies to just slap a sticker on their window saying they support it. They need to actually change the way they do business, how they hire, who they work with. It's real commitment.
So it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
You got it.
Holding these institutions accountable for their actions and their promises.
Exactly. And that leads us to unity, the big picture stuff.
Unity, yeah, sounds kind of like the ultimate goal,
Yeah.
right? Everyone coming together.
Yeah.
But how do we get there? Kumbaya moments alone aren't going to cut it.
No, definitely not. It's about building a shared national identity that values and celebrates the cultures and heritage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
Right.
Seeing Indigenous cultures as a source of strength and pride for all Australians.
So weaving those cultures into the fabric of what it means to be Australian, not just treating them as separate or something to be tolerated.
You got it. Okay, now that we've got a grasp of these 5 dimensions, let's get real. Where does the report say Australia stands today on this whole reconciliation journey? Are we strolling along? Are we sprinting ahead, or are we stuck in the mud?
Well, we started off with that 95% figure, which seems super promising.
It's hopeful.
So things must be going pretty well, right?
There are definitely some bright spots the report talks about, a growing awareness of Indigenous cultures and the impact of colonization. And there are some great success stories coming out of local communities, real people making a difference.
Ooh, dude, give me some good news here. What kind of local initiatives are working?
Well, picture this in some communities. Indigenous elders are now teaching their native languages in the very schools where it was once forbidden.
Wow.
50 years ago, that was unimaginable.
That's a powerful turnaround. Talk about reclaiming what was lost. It's like these schools aren't just teaching language, they're teaching resilience and a whole lot of history in the process.
Exactly. And there's this other community. They've established a cultural center
Mhm.
where indigenous artists can showcase their work and share their traditions with everyone. It's become a real hub for connection and celebration.
Okay, so there's definitely some positive momentum happening on the ground, but I have a feeling the report doesn't sugarcoat things either.
Mhm.
What are some of the challenges that are still holding Australia back from reaching that full reconciliation vision?
You're right. The report doesn't shy away from the hard truths. And here's a big one. Despite this growing awareness, many Indigenous Australians still face racism every single day.
Hold on, how can that be? We just talked about 95% of Australians being on board with this whole reconciliation thing.
It's a stark reminder that good intentions don't automatically translate into changed behaviors and systems.
Yeah.
It's like we might intellectually understand the importance of reconciliation,
Uh-huh.
but that doesn't mean we've all unlearned the prejudices and biases that have been ingrained for generations.
It's like saying you support recycling but never actually sorting your trash actions speak louder than words.
Exactly, and that disconnect is evident in other areas too. The report reveals a real frustration over the slow pace of progress in closing the gap, especially in those crucial areas of health, education, and employment.
So it's like we're taking baby steps when we need to be making giant leaps. What's causing this lag? Is it lack of funding, political will, or something else entirely?
It's a complex mix of factors,
Mm.
but the report definitely points to a sense that political will is lagging behind public sentiment.
Case in point, the government's rejection of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. That had to be a major blow. Can you remind our listeners what that was all about?
Yeah, it was a historic gathering of indigenous leaders, and they came up with this powerful proposal,
Uh-huh.
a constitutionally enshrined voice to parliament, basically a way for indigenous Australians to have a direct say in the policies that directly affect their lives.
Sounds pretty reasonable, right? Like having a seat at the table when decisions are being made about your future.
You'd think so, but the government shot it down.
But you mentioned earlier that public support for reconciliation is sky high. What's the disconnect there?
That's the head scratcher.
Yeah.
The report actually cites a 66% approval rating for the voice to parliament proposal. So public support is clearly there. It seems like something else is at play, maybe political maneuvering or just plain resistance to ceding power.
This whole situation just highlights the complexities of achieving real lasting change.
Yeah.
It's not just about ticking boxes or making grand pronouncements. It's about addressing those deeply ingrained power imbalances and systemic issues that continue to marginalize Indigenous communities. And sometimes it feels like those in power are more interested in maintaining the status quo than actually rocking the boat.
You're hitting the nail on the head, and that brings us to a really tragic example of how fragile progress can be, the Jukin Gorge incident.
Yeah, that was devastating. For those who might not be familiar, can you fill us in what happened and why was it such a big deal?
In 2020, this mining company, Rio Tinto, blasted two ancient rock shelters in Western Australia. And it wasn't just any old rocks. These sites were 46,000 years old and held immense cultural and spiritual significance to the local indigenous groups.
I remember hearing about this. Didn't they know beforehand that these sites were sacred?
They absolutely did. Rio Tinto was well aware of the cultural value of these sites,
Oh, wow.
but they blew them up anyway to expand their iron ore mine.
Talk about profit over people. It's just infuriating.
It sparked outrage across Australia, and internationally people were like, how could this happen in this day and age?
Right.
It exposed the blatant disregard for indigenous heritage that still exists within certain sectors.
It's like a giant step backward after all the talk about reconciliation and progress.
Exactly. It was a major wake-up call, a stark reminder that corporate greed can easily trump cultural sensitivity, and that we need stronger legal protections for indigenous heritage sites.
So after Jukin Gorge, the big question is, where do we go from here? How do we ensure that something like that never happens again?
The report calls for a shift from safe to brave reconciliation efforts, basically moving beyond those symbolic gestures and feel-good initiatives to tackle the systemic issues head-on.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break down this brave reconciliation idea for me. What does it look like in action?
Well, it means facing those uncomfortable truths about our past and present. It's about speaking truth to power, even when it's risky. It's about challenging the status quo and pushing for those big structural changes that address the root causes of inequality.
So it's about moving beyond awareness and getting into the messy, challenging work of dismantling those systems of oppression that have been in place for centuries.
You got it. And that's where things get really interesting, because this brave reconciliation isn't just for politicians and CEOs. It's a call to action for all Australians. We all have a role to play.
Okay, I'm ready to roll up my sleeves, but where do we even begin? The report must have some specific recommendations for how to put this brave reconciliation into practice, right?
It absolutely does, and it doesn't shy away from getting specific. So let's dive into some of those key areas for action.
Mm.
So the report, it dives into each of those 5 dimensions we were talking about.
Huh?
Historical acceptance, race relations, all those pillars
Oh.
of reconciliation.
Yeah.
And it lays out some pretty specific actions for each one.
Okay, so it's not just a theoretical framework, it's an actual roadmap for getting stuff
A
done.
roadmap.
Yeah, let's start with race relations. We talked about how racism is still a major problem despite, all the good intentions. What can we actually do about that?
The report really stresses truth-telling and education as a way to combat racism.
Yeah,
Think about it. You can't really dismantle something if you don't fully understand it.
right.
So learning about indigenous cultures and histories, that's key.
Yeah, it's like you can't just gloss over the past and expect things to magically get better. We need to
Mm.
actually confront those uncomfortable truths about our history and how they continue to shape the present.
Right, and the report goes beyond just history lessons. It encourages supporting those anti-racism campaigns, challenging unconscious bias even in ourselves, and calling out systemic racism wherever we see it, whether it's in our workplaces or institutions.
So it's about changing hearts and minds, but also changing the systems and structures that perpetuate inequality.
Exactly. And speaking of systems, that brings us to equality and equity. Remember, this is all about closing the gap in health, education, employment, all those areas where Indigenous Australians are still disadvantaged.
Yeah, we hear a lot about closing the gap, but the report acknowledges that progress has been way too slow. What needs to change to speed things up?
Well, the report calls for genuine partnership with Indigenous peoples in policy development and implementation.
Hmm.
It's not about imposing solutions from the top down.
Right.
It's about listening to and working alongside Indigenous communities to figure out what they actually need and want.
It's about respecting their right to self-determination, right? Giving them more control over their own destinies.
Exactly. And this is where the Uluru Statement from the Heart comes back into play. That call for a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. That's all about ensuring that Indigenous Australians have a real say in the decisions that affect their lives.
Okay, so we've talked about changing attitudes and changing systems. Now, what about those institutions we mentioned earlier? How do we hold them accountable for their role in reconciliation?
Well, the report stresses that institutional integrity is key, and it challenges those RAP organizations, those reconciliation action plans that many companies and organizations have adopted,
Yeah.
to go beyond simply ticking boxes.
I'm guessing it means actually putting those words into action.
Right. It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. It's about actively advocating for policy changes that address systemic issues, supporting Indigenous-led initiatives, and using their platform to speak out against injustice.
So it's about taking risks and challenging the status quo, even when it's uncomfortable, and not just for big institutions, right? Individuals can step up too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We can all play a role in advancing reconciliation, whether it's educating ourselves about Indigenous cultures and histories, supporting Indigenous businesses, or calling out racist jokes and stereotypes. We can all contribute.
Sometimes those small actions can feel insignificant, but they add up, don't they?
Exactly. It's like that ripple effect. Each action creates waves that can spread far and wide.
Okay, we've covered race relations, equality and equity, and institutional integrity. Now let's circle back to unity, that big picture goal of building a shared national identity. How do we actually make that happen? Is it just about having more barbecues together?
Barbecues are great, but there's a lot more to it than that. The report highlights the need to celebrate and promote Indigenous cultures and achievements as part of a shared national identity. Think of it as weaving those cultures into the fabric of what it means to be Australian, not just treating them as something separate or exotic.
It's like recognizing that Indigenous cultures are not just part of Australia's past. They're a vibrant and essential part of its present and future.
Exactly. And it's not just about big national campaigns. It's about those everyday interactions and exchanges, learning a few words of an Indigenous language, visiting a cultural center, watching a film by an Indigenous director. Those small steps can make a big difference in building understanding and respect.
It's about fostering those personal connections that bridge the divides and create a sense of shared belonging. Okay, we've covered 4 of the 5 dimensions: historical acceptance, race relations, equality and equity and unity. But we haven't talked much about that first one. Historical acceptance, why is acknowledging the past so crucial to reconciliation?
It's like trying to build a house on shaky foundations. If we don't address the wrongs of the past, if we don't acknowledge the pain and trauma that colonization inflicted on Indigenous peoples, then we can't move forward in a meaningful way.
So it's about more than just saying sorry. It's about understanding the deep and lasting impact of those past actions and how they continue to shape the present.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that those wounds haven't magically disappeared just because we don't talk about them.
It's like trying to ignore a broken bone. It's not going to heal itself unless you set it properly and give it time to mend.
That's a great analogy. And the report emphasizes truth-telling initiatives as a way to start that healing process. That means supporting projects that document Indigenous histories, creating spaces for truth-telling and reconciliation, and ensuring that those stories are shared widely.
It's about giving voice to those who have been silenced for too long and ensuring that their experiences are not forgotten or erased. And I'm guessing it also involves memorialization, acknowledging those dark chapters in Australian history and honoring the victims.
Absolutely. And it's not just about remembering the past. It's about learning from it and making sure that those injustices are never repeated.
Yeah.
The report also talks about restoring history, which sounds pretty intriguing. What's that all about?
Yeah, what is that?
It's about incorporating Indigenous perspectives and experiences into the dominant narrative of Australian history. It's about moving beyond that Eurocentric view and telling a more complete and accurate story of this land and its people.
So it's like challenging that traditional narrative and saying, hey, there's a whole other side to the story that's been ignored for too long.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about recognizing that Indigenous history is not just a footnote or a separate chapter. It's woven into the very fabric of Australian history.
And that brings us back to those local initiatives we were talking about earlier, those schools teaching Indigenous languages, those communities establishing cultural centers. Seems like that's where a lot of this restoring is actually happening on the ground organically.
You're right. A lot of the most exciting and innovative work is happening at the grassroots level. It's like people are saying, we don't need to wait for the government or big institutions to tell us how to do reconciliation. We can create our own spaces and tell our own stories.
It's a powerful reminder that change doesn't always have to come from the top down. It can also bubble up from the bottom. And that brings us back to that question we posed earlier. Where do we go from here?
The report highlights some major challenges: racism, slow progress in closing the gap, the destruction of sacred sites like Juukan Gorge. It can all feel pretty overwhelming. What gives you hope that real lasting change is possible? Honestly, it's those local initiatives, those stories of everyday people taking action and making a difference. It's seeing Indigenous communities reclaim their cultures and languages. It's witnessing non-Indigenous Australians step up as allies and advocates. It's that groundswell of support for reconciliation that we talked about earlier, that 95% figure.
It's easy to get lost in all the, like the doom and gloom,
Yeah.
the slow progress, the setbacks, just the scale of it all.
It's heavy stuff.
It's heavy stuff, but I think it's super important to remember that reconciliation is ultimately about hope,
Right.
believing that a better future is possible, a future where Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians can just walk together as equals, celebrating our shared history and building a more just and equitable society for everyone.
You're absolutely right. It's not just about fixing problems. It's about creating something new and beautiful.
Mm.
A society that values and respects the oldest living cultures on Earth.
And that's the vision that keeps me going, honestly, because let's face it, this whole reconciliation thing, it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's going to take time and effort, a whole lot of patience, but the report, it gives me hope that we're on the right track.
I agree. That statistic, we keep coming back to the fact that 95% of Australians see the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples as important. I mean, that's huge. It tells me that the vast majority of Australians are on board with this journey, even if we don't always agree on the best way to get there.
Yeah, it's like we're all in this canoe together, paddling towards that shared horizon.
I like it, though.
We might hit some rough waters along the way, but we're all ultimately headed in the same direction. And that sense of shared purpose, that collective will to create a better future, that's what gives me hope.
And it's not just a top-down thing.
Yeah.
The report highlights all these amazing local initiatives that are happening all over the country, communities coming together to drive change from the ground up.
Yeah, those grassroots efforts are so inspiring. They remind me that reconciliation isn't just something that happens, in Canberra or in corporate boardrooms. It's something we can all participate in no matter where we live or what our background is.
Exactly. It's about building bridges, fostering understanding, and creating a sense of shared purpose in our own communities. And the report gives some fantastic examples of how people are doing just that.
Ooh, I love a good success story. Give us some highlights. What are some of the most inspiring local initiatives that the report showcases?
Well, one that really stood out to me was this school, Mossman State School in far north Queensland. They've done an incredible job of integrating the local Aboriginal language, Yulanji, into their curriculum. And get this, 50 years ago speaking, Yulanji on school grounds was actually forbidden.
Wow, talk about a complete 180. That's incredible. So the very language that was once silenced is now being celebrated and embraced.
Exactly. And the coolest part is that the elders who experienced that suppression are now working alongside the teachers to bring their language back to life. It's such a powerful example of how reconciliation can heal old wounds and create a more inclusive future for everyone.
It gives me chills. It's like those kids aren't just learning a language, they're learning about their community's history, their culture, their resilience, and they're learning that their language, their heritage is something to be proud of.
Absolutely. And it's not just about language. There are communities all over Australia who are establishing cultural centers, running art workshops, organizing festivals, all sorts of creative ways to connect with Indigenous cultures and histories.
It's like a cultural renaissance is happening, and it's being driven by passion, creativity, and a deep desire to share those stories and traditions with a wider audience.
You got it. And it's not just happening in remote communities either. The report highlights initiatives in urban areas too, like community gardens that incorporate Indigenous plants and knowledge, or art installations that tell the stories of the traditional owners of the land.
It's like Indigenous culture is finding its way back into the fabric of our cities, reclaiming space and visibility in places where it was once erased or ignored.
Exactly. And that's a really encouraging sign. It shows that reconciliation isn't just happening on the fringes, it's becoming more mainstream, more visible, more integrated into our everyday lives.
That's what gives me hope, seeing those little sparks of change popping up everywhere, like a constellation of hope spreading across the country. But I'm curious, you mentioned earlier that, some stakeholders felt the local reconciliation movement wasn't as strong as it once was. Is that a concern?
It's definitely something to be mindful of. The report acknowledges that the energy and momentum that fueled the early days of the reconciliation movement may have waned a bit in recent years.
Mm.
People might be feeling a bit fatigued,
Yeah.
a bit disillusioned by the slow pace of change.
Yeah, I can see that it's like you pour your heart and soul into something, but then the results don't come as quickly as you'd hoped, and it's easy to feel discouraged.
Exactly. But the report also suggests that there's a renewed sense of urgency, particularly in light of events like the Black Lives Matter protests and the Jukin Gorge destruction. Those events really shook things up and sparked important conversations about race and injustice in Australia.
Yeah, they were like wake-up calls reminding us that there's still so much work to be done that we can't afford to become complacent.
Right. And the report emphasizes the need to re-energize those local communities to provide them with the resources and support they need to keep pushing forward.
So it's about acknowledging the fatigue, but also about finding ways to reignite that passion, that sense of purpose, that belief that change is possible.
Absolutely. And the report offers some great ideas for how to do that. It encourages RAP organizations, businesses, and community groups to go beyond those symbolic gestures and really step up their game to engage in more substantive actions that address systemic issues.
It's about moving from awareness to action, from safe to brave, from ticking boxes to actually making a difference.
You got it. And it's a reminder that reconciliation isn't just a feel-good concept. It's about creating a more just and equitable society for all Australians.
And that's a goal worth fighting for, even when it feels hard, even when progress is slow, even when we face setbacks. Because ultimately, reconciliation is about hope, about believing that a better future is possible.
Well said. And it's a future that we create together, one step at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of kindness at a time.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. It's given us a lot to think about and hopefully inspired some of our listeners to get involved in the reconciliation journey.
I hope so too. Remember, even small actions can make a difference, whether it's learning more about Indigenous cultures, challenging racist attitudes, or supporting Indigenous-led initiatives. We can all contribute to creating a more reconciled Australia.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to explore the full report for yourselves. It's packed with information, case studies, and inspiring stories of individuals and communities making a difference. You can find it online at reconciliation.org.au.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Let's keep the conversation going and work together to build a more just and equitable Australia for all.